What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And today we're going to be recapping Regional Championship Portland that just wrapped up this past weekend and is the first of two regional championships here in the United States. And I'm so excited because as a content creator, that means I get to cover twice as much, Magic in the United States. And these metagames are always, kind of what we expect. But at the same time, the matches and stuff and how they actually play out are really exciting. And this did not disappoint. Always a big fan of what show Star City Games ends up putting on, the commentators that they get in the booth, and of course the players that they end up featuring. Some pretty interesting matchups, and I look forward to bringing you all that information here today. We're going to be covering the Day 1, Day 2 metagame breakdown, getting an understanding of what the conversion rate kind of looks like, as that's kind of some of the best data that we can get, is seeing what decks, turn Day 1 that players registered, ended up turning that into a Day 2 finish, and of course checking out the top 8 to about the top 25 of the event, as I believe that's kind of where, if one match result that's maybe a 1-2 in your opponent's favor ends up going 2-1 in your favor, accounting for some mistakes where we can kind of, draw that conclusion that you'd actually be able to make the top 8 or make the top 16, even though top 32 is where you want to be for these regional championships, because that's where the Pro Tour invite is. And then after that, you need to make it to the finals to get that World Championship invite. So we're going to see who our World Championship competitors are, get a glimpse at some of the Pro Tour competitors that we're going to be seeing at this event. So you definitely want to stick around and watch that as we kind of navigate through some of this information here from the event. Of course, giving my own personal thoughts and opinions on very specific decks currently in the metagame, because I definitely have some thoughts after watching all the Magic that was played this weekend. But of course, before we get into any of that stuff, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we do breakdowns like this kind of regularly when we have these big events, we even do it for all the other regional championships in the other regions of the world. On top of doing the Pro Tour and World Championship invites, we do some pretty great detail in those events. So if you definitely want to check those out, you want to be more involved in competitive Magic, where we do cover a lot of Standard and Modern, as those are the current competitive formats for Magic the Gathering, then be sure to subscribe, ring the notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. Leave a like on the video, of course, if you enjoyed it at any point. It does help out with the algorithm, and it does support me and my channel as we kind of try to expand our horizon here. We're trying to get to 2K before the end of the year, so definitely help us reach that goal. And of course, check out the description down below where we have links to my Discord server, Twitch channel, if that's something that interests you. We're going to try live streaming multiple times a week, so I'm hoping that we can kind of get that off the ground. Of course, I have another channel called the Casual Spikes Podcast that's linked down there, where me and my co-host Randy over at MTG with Randy do the same kind of breakdowns, and we try to give our own kind of like analytical pieces of wisdom that we may or may not have, sorry water bottle, that we have about the modern and standard formats or whatever's going on, and talk about other Magic news. Finally, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. If you use my code in the description down below, you have 5% off your monthly subscription, so you can rent cards and play on Magic Online and play in some of these challenges and leagues where maybe you could possibly qualify for the Pro Tour through their online system. So definitely go check out the sponsor of the video. And with all that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the Day 1 metagame breakdown for the Regional Championship in Portland. So here we have the Day 1 metagame breakdown for Regional Championship Portland. There was 1,031 players registered for this event, way down from the 1,800 some odd people that were at the last Regional Championship in Washington, D.C. that I'm glad that I got to be a part of and crash and burn magnificently in Day 1. But here we have this metagame breakdown. 1,031 players, definitely getting the result that we wanted for having two regional championships, is getting those numbers down. Of course, lessening the amount of Pro Tour invites that are given out, split them between the two events. Of course, getting 2 more Worlds invites in there as well. So definitely some pros and cons to it, but, here we are. And kind of a surprising thing, I had Boros Energy, or just the energy archetype in general, just being the number 1 archetype. It was by far and away the most represented archetype in the regional championships that took place a few weeks ago, and I kind of thought it was a given. I even called it like a free bingo square, like that was just a free prediction, and I'll say that I was technically wrong, but also technically right, and I think technically right's better than actually right, so to me, I count that as a win. But we actually have, and thank you, I believe this is Nick Miller who does all this stuff, so awesome stuff. But instead of just having, Teamer Breach and Boros Energy in those numbers, they end up including, essentially every color combination or every version of essentially the same archetype, so thank you for that. But we have a dead tie at the number 1 spot in the metagame between Breach, which is between the Teamer and 4-color, and then Energy, Boros, Jeskai, Mardu, and Naya at 203 decks apiece, 19.7% of the metagame. So almost 40% of the metagame was either Breach or Energy. That's not really surprising. To a lot of people, Breach was just the best deck already. To me, I know that I had Energy kind of up there. It was like, well, you got to kind of knock it off the cliff here, take it off its seat to be able to, at least for me, claim the number 1 spot. Maybe that doesn't necessarily work in Wizard Squares, but to me, that just seemed to make sense. But a dead tie here at the top of the metagame, followed by Eldrazi Ramp, which is a deck that I thought was a pretty good counter meta pick to things like Breach. I think that I really like the main deck Karn the Great Curator, and then the kind of sideboard, wish board that it gets to play, where it can go and get any artifact that can kind of help it, deal with graveyard hate. It has Tormod's Crypt it can go get from the sideboard, play immediately that turn to kind of mess with the graveyard, things like that. Stonebrain being a huge thing against these other combo decks. So I really enjoyed the Eldrazi Ramp deck kind of for that reason, and it just has a lot of draws where it just overwhelms your opponent, and playing in a 13 mana Emrakul is absolutely insane. Then next up at 9.3% of the metagame, 96 decks, we have the Blink variant. So Orzhov being the most popular, it's Selesnya, Bant, and Mono White. This is like that kind of Aether Vial. We've been calling it Orzhov Sewers, and spoiler alert, I don't think we can call it Sewers anymore. I think this deck is actually legit and performed very well, I think, all weekend. I think there was times where it did look kind of anemic, but then I could say the same thing for a lot of these decks where they just kind of looked bad at spots. But at least the Orzhov deck, I always think looked pretty respectable on camera and just seems like it's a very solid option in the metagame going forward. Oculus, the Dimir and Esper versions, I thought Esper would be a little bit more popular than the Dimir version. I think the white sideboard cards are great currently, with Breach being one of the best decks to be playing in the format. That, again, having access to like Pest Control for something like Energy, and then access to stuff like Stony Silence or whatever in the sideboard for these Dimir and Esper Oculus decks, I thought would have been kind of nice additions to kind of, again, slow them down. They can put on a relatively quick clock, all things considered. And showing up here at 58 decks, 5.6% of the metagame. Amulet Titan, the deck that just won't go away and probably the bane of my existence, 5.4% of the metagame. Domain Zoo, it starts to kind of drop off a little bit here, where we have a little less than half of the decks at 2.3%, 24 total. Ruby Storm shortly behind it at 2.2%. Belcher at 22 copies at 2.1%. Slowly starting to fall out of favor. I think when we had these metagames where Boros Energy is like 25, 26% of the metagame, Mono Blue Belcher gets a lot better just because that deck kind of came out of the fact that Boros Energy was kind of the most played deck in the format. And I think now that Breach is kind of getting up in there and can be an even faster combo deck, that Belcher might have some problems going forward in the future. And then we have Golgari Yawgmoth at 15 copies at 1.5% of the metagame. Reanimator, Esper, Grixis variants at 1.1%. Eldrazi Tron is tied there as well at 1.1%. Dimir Mill, 9 copies, 0.9% of the metagame. And then Jeskai Control, Jund Creativity, 0.8% a piece, and then the other 132 decks, another mishmash and hodgepodge of things that you could be playing in this modern format, making up the other 12.8% of the metagame, again, making up the 1,031 decks that we had seen in day one. So kind of some surprising things, I would say. Breach is definitely not held back by the cost of the deck. I thought that would be kind of a pinch point for it. I'd assume that a lot of these people playing this deck already had Mox Opals laying around, and that's kind of like the lion's share of the cost of the deck. And again, it's a very good deck. I shouldn't even say very good. It's probably one of the best decks in the format, and just completely wrecks face every tournament that we kind of see it play in. And I don't expect that to change going forward. We don't expect really very many changes. I don't know if Aether Drift as of right now is going to impact the format very highly. The one big thing I've kind of seen it is like the Ketramos combo stuff that we more see in like the frog style shells. I've heard from some players just might not even be really that good. And of course, people just absolutely taking a crap on it. Just kind of something that players can do differently in the format, I suppose. But overall, I would say this is kind of the metagame that we expected. I didn't think that necessarily. I figured Breach, Energy, and Eldrazi Ramp were going to be the top 3 decks. I didn't think that Breach and Energy were going to be tied for the most played. I figured it was going to be Energy, Breach, and Ramp. But, again, technically kind of right. And then I thought Orzhov Blink as well was going to kind of shoot up there in percentage. And I think it was at like 4 or 5% of the previous regional championship in Prague. And it's up to almost 10% here at the United States Regional Championship in Portland. So definitely some interesting stuff there. Oculus not completely falling off the map. Definitely a knockoff, a fall off, if you will, from it being the second most registered deck or tied for the second most registered deck in Prague going into Portland, where I believe it ends up being fifth. And of course, Amulet Titan kind of hanging around in there. And that just kind of seems to be the popular archetypes that players are playing and choosing to go towards when kind of combating this Breach / Energy / Eldrazi ramp metagame. So, we got 1,031 players. Let's go ahead and take a look at our day 2 metagame and kind of see how these shifted. The important thing we're going to be looking at is like the percentage of decks that we have 203 decks saved for Breach. We want to know how many decks end up converting it and how much of the day 2 metagame it ended up actually being, which thankfully they also have a graphic for that as well, because Star City Games is absolutely goated. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at the day 2 metagame and kind of see how these decks ended up, doing with their opportunity in day 1 to try to make day 2 of this tournament. So here we are, day 2 metagame breakdown, and we had 239 players qualify for day 2 out of the 1,031 that ended up showing up. So you had to have a 6-3 record or better. So you could technically get in, I believe, with like 5-0-3 or something like that, because you need like 18 match points total. Something crazy. You're probably not top 8ing with a record like that, but just technically some interesting information that that's how you could end up making day 2 of the event, which is pretty neat, I would say. But here we go. Now, very clearly, Boros Energy and the Energy variants and the Breach variants were tied at the top of the metagame, 203 decks apiece. Well, Breach definitely separated itself from the pack here, putting 68 decks into day 2, good enough for a 28.5% metagame share. Then we have Energy following it up at 17.2% of the metagame, 41 of those decks getting in. And very interestingly, Eldrazi Ramp also putting 39 copies into day 2 at 16.3%. So just looking at straight percentages, we were at like 19.7% for Breach, up from that to 28.5%. Energy decks, where I think typically when you have decks that have a high percentage in day 1, you kind of want to see that percentage come down. I think that's just kind of a natural thing for a lot of decks to happen, and Boros Energy definitely had that. It doesn't help that Breach is probably one of its worst matchups it can play against. Sure, it can beat it, but it does feel kind of awful from the Energy side, and it was down from 19.7% to 17.2%. Eldrazi Ramp up slightly, up to 16.3%. Orzhov Blink, I think we were at like 9.3% or maybe 10, so maybe a little bit of draw off, maybe a little bit of a gain. Not 100% sure on that number, but staying relatively the same percentage, which is a good thing for the deck. Amulet Titan, I believe, is up a little bit. Oculus, I think, hovering around. Maybe it's actually a little bit lower, but only 11 copies in the day 2. And then we have Ruby Storm, Mono Blue Belcher, both at 6 copies at 2.5%. And then we have Domain Zoo and Abzan Samwise, which wasn't even represented in the breakdown. It was just Yawgmoth, and it ends up actually being on the board for the day 2 metagame and actually converting better than Yawgmoth at 1.7% of the metagame, Yawgmoth being down to 1.3%, along with Mono Black Necro and the Eldrazi Breach, which is just like actual through the breach, not, Underworld Breach stuff. And then we have Just Guy Control, Jund Creativity at 2 copies at 0.8% apiece, with 9 other decks making up the other 3.8% of the metagame. So our big 3 here in the format, Breach, Energy, Ramp. Energy is the only one that kind of takes a hit, and that I think that's kind of to be expected. I think at this point players understand kind of the Energy matchup and what they need to do and how to attack it, while also trying to combat like the Breach stuff going on. I just think Breach is a lot more unfair. That, of course, Breach is going to, I think, perform a little bit better because it just has a lot of games where it can cheese out some wins just by having fast kills. Opponent thinking that maybe they have another turn, and turns out that they don't. Whatever the case may be, Breach definitely ate. It was cooking in day 1 and absolutely showed that in the day 2 metagame, where again, it's 28, almost 30% of the metagame from there. Boros Energy, again, holding steady, 17.2% is definitely nothing to snub your nose at, but when Eldrazi Ramp was quite a few percentage points behind you, and it's just 2 decks off, put 2 less decks into day 2 off of, 50 less decks or whatever it was. It's a pretty insane, gap to kind of close from the Eldrazi side, and definitely proving that it's a deck that is going to be a mainstay of this format should nothing get hit from it in our, I believe, March 3 announcement, which I don't think anything will technically from that, just with it being in the middle of the regional championship season. And of course, the continued fall off of the Oculus decks, where it doesn't seem like necessarily the white splash in the deck is going to help out that much. So we're going to kind of have to see how things kind of transpire from there, because they definitely have to go back to the lab and put in a little bit more work. Titan as well. God, I hate this deck so much. Proving that it is a very solid metagame option. It's a deck that, kind of like Breach, where it does have some really unfair starts where your opponent thinks that maybe they have another turn and just turns out that they don't. You just end up getting like 2-3 amulets in play, playing a bounce land, play a Titan, and make copies and do a bunch of stuff. And I believe even the one that we're going to be looking here in in the top 8 is going to have some pretty spicy tech for us there, which is going to be pretty sweet. And maybe a standard in these Titan decks. I don't know, because, get that away from me. I don't want that. But, overall, you could argue that this is relatively unhealthy. I mean, Breach being almost 30% of the metagame is pretty crazy, all things considered. I mean, almost 20%, like 19.7 just on the cusp, up to almost 28.5%, 29% of the metagame. That's a pretty significant jump to kind of make when everybody else is kind of making these small gains, small losses here. So definitely going to be interesting to see what Breach does going forward, but I think very clearly Head & Shoulders probably one of the best decks, if not the best deck going in the format. I think has probably knocked Energy off the cliff, unless Energy can somehow turn this into a win. Definitely not impossible when, again, there's like 230 some odd decks and you're 17% of the metagame. There's got to be someone that can at least crawl into the top 8 somewhere and maybe get lucky enough to beat some of these Breach matchups. So let's go ahead. We're going to check out the top 8 bracket and, of course, show you the results of those events, or rather those matches. I don't know why I call them events. And we'll end up looking at the top 25 and then, of course, wrapping up with some thoughts about these different decks here at the regional championship. So here we have our top 8 bracket, how it fully played out. We have Amulet Titan was the number 1 overall seed, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me, because I don't think anybody would have necessarily picked Titan unless you were just a big Titan fan. Playing against Peter Tubergen, who was playing Grinding Breach, another Grinding Breach, and Enzo Burke and Gabriel Nicholas playing Boros Energy. Damian Del Nero and Alan Hubbard, the Eldrazi Ramp Mirror, and then Jackson Knorr playing Grinding Breach, and Joe Doolittle playing Orzhov Blink. So for those keeping track at home, that's 3 Breach decks in the top 8. That is 2 Eldrazi Ramp. That is a Boros Energy, an Amulet Titan, and an Orzhov Blink, rounding out your top 8 of the event. Of course, you can see how the events played out here. The Peter versus Peter matchup was actually a rematch from earlier in day 2, where Peter ended up losing that match, and of course ended up losing this one to Peter, 2-0. Enzo Burke and Gabriel Nicholas, definitely, as we talked about at the beginning, Grinding Breach is a bad matchup for Boros Energy, but hey, managing to go and actually win that match there, 2-1 against the Grinding Breach deck. The Eldrazi Ramp Mirror, this was one that finished off camera, but Damian seemingly very easily winning 2-0. Definitely helps being on the play in a deck that gets to play, Stone Rain plus Rampant Growth, even like better Rampant Growth. And then in the 2 versus 7, Grinding Breach versus Orzhov Blink, it honestly didn't even look like it was really that close. Jackson Knorr showing very good mastery of his deck and just absolutely belittling Doolittle when Doolittle was actually the player that was undefeated after day 1, the 9-0 player, and I believe won this round 10 matchup. I don't know, it was kind of a while ago, but that's how she rolls sometimes. So for those of you keeping track, our top seeds won 3 of the 4 games, with Gabriel Nicholas on Boros Energy being the only player to not win. So unfortunately, going to be on the draw had they make it to the finals. Peter versus Gabriel, Amulet Titan versus Boros Energy. Boros Energy actually won game 1 against the Amulet Titan deck, and then Amulet Titan took both sideboarded games to move on to the finals, and of course Peter getting the World Championship invite, so congratulations to them. Then we have Damian versus Jackson. Not even really close. I would have said Eldrazi Ramp was probably favored in the Grinding Breach matchup, just because it has some tools in the main board with mainly Karn the Great Creator, where I think if you can get a Karn the Great Creator down on turn 2 against Grinding Breach, of course Grinding Breach getting into play on this matchup, so it is a little bit harder that you can end up getting Karn, and then Karn gets an immediate second lock piece, and then you'll get Karn off the table to get a third one, and that's really hard for Grinding Breach to play through 3 different pieces of hate. all at the same time, while this Eldrazi ramp deck is then able to just throw haymakers at you and, again, Stone Rain you, able to get rid of any of your other random artifacts that are sitting on the board, and of course take your turn, and if you're set up to kind of go off on the next turn, you can just end up getting, milled out, and then, game over. The lights get turned off, but not happening there. Grinding Breach taking it very solidly at 2-0 to lock up our 1 and 2 seed to a battle to the death, or at least a battle of first place here at the regional championship. Amulet Titan versus Grinding Breach. Again, probably not the finals that anybody had on their radar, and I certainly would have thought Grinding Breach would have been the favorite. I think Jackson had been playing great, really all top 8. Not to say Peter wasn't playing amazing, because he had some really sweet Titan lines, and just getting to do the thing. And ended up actually winning the event 2-1 over Grinding Breach. Both players locking up a World Championship invite. And, of course, Peter winning that $20,000, the sweet trophy, and, of course, just leaving, holding the bag. Just a bag of riches here. So congratulations to Peter on winning the event, and Amulet Titan taking down, just a field of Boros Energy, Eldrazi Ramp, and Breach, and just showing that the deck still has what it takes to kind of hang with some of the top dogs of the format. Definitely not willing to christen this as a necessarily tier 1 deck, but definitely a very, very, very solid option. And if you've been playing Amulet Titan and, you played it for a long time, maybe you abandon the deck to go and play any one of the other 3 or 4 decks that we see kind of showing up in the metagame, it's definitely worth looking at Amulet Titan and kind of kicking the tires on it and seeing how it feels. And Grinding Breach, of course, just, again, being a fantastic deck to be on in this format, so definitely Grinding Breach by its standards, definitely came up short. I would say definitely a disappointing tournament, which is kind of crazy to say for a deck that had the highest conversion rate into day 2, even though it was the most played deck in day 1, most played deck in day 2, most played deck in top 8, and, coming up short in the finals. So it kind of got to do everything that it wanted to do. But, that's our bracket here. I'm going to look at the top 16 standings, and we're going to kind of go into individual thoughts for each of these decks. I have probably about 6 or 7 different decks that I kind of want to talk about. So we're going to kind of hit on some of those real quick here at the end of the video. So make sure you stick around for that. So here we have the top 25 from the event here. Of course, we know Peter Terbergen was our 8th seeded player, and the cutoff looks like to be 11-2-2. It does count your record in the top 8 of the event. So Peter did not go 11-3-2 to make the top 8, and Julian John missed by 1 point. There was, 11-2-2, or 11-2-2 seemed to be the cutoff here for top 8. So Julian John, first player on the outside looking in. Again, we see this, if this result changes, maybe instead of a 11-1 or 11-3-1, we see like a 12-2-1, or even just a 12-3. That could definitely make the difference. That kind of puts you up here, towards the middle of the pack, maybe towards the bottom of the event. So definitely kind of like what we're talking about here. All these 11-3 players here, 11-3-1, any of these convert that draw into a win, which I would also believe, too, that a lot of these players probably drew for the fact that, this essentially locks up the top 32 and locks up your invite to the Pro Tour. So kind of no reason to play it out, but if that's kind of in the position that we were in, there's a lot of these players that could have been playing for, top 8 potentially, or if even one other match kind of goes their way, they're into this top 8, which is, kind of really what we want to see. Of course, we know what our top 8 is. Boros Energy, Amulet Titan are the first 2 decks on the outside looking in, followed by 4 Grinding Breach decks, then an Energy player, and then Grinding Breach, 2 Eldrazi Ramp decks, a bunch of Grinding Breach, Jeskai Energy, Orzhov Blink, and then another Grinding Breach deck to wrap out our top 25, which, without really even counting, that's 1, 2, I guess we'll count now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 energy or 10 breach decks, that were left on the outside, with 3 making the top 8. So over half of our top 25 was Grinding Breach decks. Now, whether that's the 4-color versions, that's strictly the teamer versions, we could probably look individually and see. But overall, the Breach archetype seems like it's absolutely insane. A lot of these players maybe, again, 1 or 2 game results away, again, turning one of those 1-2s into a 2-1, maybe converting one of those draws into a win. Again, more than likely, those were kind of intentional draws, since, again, top 32 locks up the Pro Tour invite. But that being said, again, just that little bit away from being able to top 8 and be playing for a world championship invite, and of course a ton of cash prizes here. Boros Energy, decently a smattering here and there. We see like Just Guy Energy here, and then one Boros Energy player here. Of course, a Boros Energy player just on the outside of the top 8, and of course a Gabe being the lone energy player in the top 8. We had 2 Eldrazi Ramp in here, and then we ended up having a second Titan player, two players playing Titan in the top 10, which is pretty neat. And then we had 2 Eldrazi Ramp decks there, 2 more Eldrazi Ramp decks showing up in towards like the bottom, like just on the outside of the top 16, and another Orzhov Blink player here to kind of round it out. So definitely not a whole lot of unique representation. I'd say Titan is the kind of weird one out of the bunch. Jeskai Energy as well being there, but really that's also just Boros Energy splashing blue. So, we're not really seeing any of the Yawgmoths. We don't see any of the Storm. We don't see any of these kind of other archetypes kind of show up, where we are seeing a lot of the Grinding Breach decks. We're seeing a lot of Amulet Titan kind of show up. I'm calling 2 copies a lot here because I would have expected 0. 2 Orzhov Blink. We have, again, the different energy variants, and of course the Eldrazi Ramp decks, but definitely the big one being the Grinding Breach decks. Just, again, it couldn't really do anything wrong this weekend. The only thing it didn't do was win the tournament. It absolutely dominated in every other metric here. So that's definitely here. If you want to see the full standings of the event, I will have the Melee page linked in the description down below. With that said, I have some individual thoughts I want to go over with a lot of these decks, so don't go anywhere. Let's go ahead and kind of finish breaking down this tournament and, again, kind of put some thoughts out there into the world of what the modern metagame could look like going forward from an individual deck standpoint, which is something we've never done on the channel. So definitely, if you enjoy it and you made it this far, please let me know in the comments down below if you preferred that or if you just want some in general thoughts of the modern metagame going forward. So from a deck perspective, what did we learn about these decks? So the thing I'm going to start with, kind of my tier 1 of the format. I only like to include 3 decks at like the top tiers. I don't think it makes any sense to have any more than that. I hope that there isn't anything less than that. I don't know if we're there. We're kind of bordering on it, but I'm going to start with just my number 1 now, and I think it's going to be the Temur Breach deck. Specifically, those variants, they seem to be the ones that performed the best over the weekend, and I think playing 4-color definitely has its advantages. Maybe in the mirror match, that's typically what we see. When Boros Energy kind of shifted to Mardu. Mardu had a pretty good matchup against the just regular generic Boros Energy decks, but Breach to me is the de facto number 1 deck in the format. I mean, we saw it be the tied for the most played deck in day 1. It was the most played deck in day 2. It had 13 copies of it in the top 25 of the regional championship. So definitely getting at least 13 players invited to the Pro Tour, insane. Got a player invited to the World Championship, 3 copies in the top 8, the most of any other deck, and of course, all it didn't do was win the event. That's it. It basically dominated in every other metric of the game. It was almost like, 2007 Patriots-esque run where, unfortunately, fumbled, or fortunately for me, because I hate New England so much with a burning passion. Oh, my God. I'm bringing up bad childhood memories. Anyway, Breach ended up getting all the way to the finish line, just couldn't cross it. It was 1 game away, and unfortunately fumbled the bag to Titan, which might actually end up being the good guy of the story, which is kind of weird to say because he's usually the villain. Weird for me. But either way, Breach seems like it is poised to dominate the rest of the regional championship season. And just like regional championship Prague, we're kind of left picking up the pieces and figuring out what we can do to actually fight off these Breach decks to kind of lower their win rate and their dominance of the format. Because as it stands right now, it's probably going to be on ban watch here really, really soon. Probably even as soon as for some players like a few weeks ago, but definitely now it has the eyes on it. Next, I'm going to go with Eldrazi Ramp. To me, I think this is solidly displaced Boros Energy. Has definitely been pretty consistent. The same amount of people that end up, the same percentage of people that played in day 1 end up converting into day 2 and then end up doing very well with the deck. Of course, it had 2 different copies in the top 8. Of course, it had to play itself in the mirror match, so definitely guaranteeing a top 4 spot, but also eliminating another one in the process here. And I think it's kind of elevated itself past just being a good counter meta pick that was decent against everything else. And I think as these 2 decks continue to have a very high usage and it continues to kind of build into the fact that, it's already going to hopefully stomp on about 40% of the metagame, that it's going to go forward and it's going to continue to be great. And it's going to continue to kind of abuse the fact that Karn the Great Creator is kind of a messed up magic card with all these powerful artifacts to kind of shore up some of its other matchups while just continuing to kind of punch up at some of the other, the other top decks of the format. And lastly, I want to talk about Boros Energy because I think it's now been thoroughly dethroned as one of the best decks in the format, or rather the best deck. For a long time, it has just been always the most played deck, whether it has the high win rate that we kind of end up seeing from these top decks. I would say not really. I think Breach has definitely kind of checked all the boxes for being the best deck in the format, but Boros Energy was just a deck that I think you always had to have respect for, and it just had crazy kills out of nowhere thanks to Goblin Bombardment and Ajani, and it's definitely leaning a lot harder on it these days now that trying to get the Guide of Souls Ocelot Pride thing isn't necessarily the best thing to be doing. I do think that it's one of the more consistent, if not the most consistent decks in the format. I think that you really can't go wrong with registering it, but definitely if you're trying to go for gold, Breach might be your best option here. If not, I think Boros Energy, if you have a lot of reps with it, Modern is definitely a format that punishes you for trying to play decks maybe outside of your wheelhouse, outside of kind of your range of knowledge here, and definitely rewards you for knowing some of the more intricate and deeper lines of certain decks, whether how good or how bad the deck might necessarily be in the format. And I think Boros Energy is kind of reaching that point where we're going to see the Boros Energy players that have been playing it a lot. They understand the different matchups, how they're going to sideboard, and they understand how to end up beating these matchups rather than seeing players kind of pick it up and play it and kind of do well with it. Not saying that any of these players necessarily did that with any of the decks here, but Boros Energy I think is going to be a lot harder to win with now that people are adequately able to kind of handle it kind of going from here. And for me, it ends up kind of claiming the last spot in like the tier 1 metagame. I still think it's a fantastic deck in the format. It's just not nearly, it doesn't have nearly the gumption, I would say, that the Breach and the Eldrazi ramp decks have. Kind of going further, we're going to kind of look on the outside looking in. I don't know if this deck can actually break into tier 1, but it seems to be more real every tournament that we have, and it's the black-white mid-range deck. We can't call it sewers anymore. I think this deck is actually the real deal. It seems like all of its kind of like black-white cards are insane. The value that it ends up getting with Thalia and Overlord of the Baelmerk is just, not necessarily game-breaking on that level, but it just has like a lot of cool and interesting things going on. It's very disruptive, and players have been performing very, very well with the deck here in challenges online, and players have been doing very well with it here in the modern, the regional championship season. 2 copies in the top 25 isn't absolutely amazing, but when you remember that like Boros Energy and some of these other decks only put maybe about the same amount or maybe 1 or 2 more copies into there, while Breach is absolutely dominating the format, is, to me, ends up being a pretty good showing for black-white mid-range, and I would not be surprised if we kind of see it break into that 10% of the metagame here going forward as players, I think, kind of narrow down some of the options for the format, and we see more specialists on these decks that are like towards the bottom of the metagame, and we see, in general, more people kind of pick up some of the other decks here at the top. So for me, black-white mid-range is definitely the real deal. I think it's a deck that is worth playing. I don't think you're necessarily going to be winning any tournaments with it. I think it is you need a very good run, I would say, with the deck, but definitely can be a threat to some of the top decks of the metagame. Amulet Titan, and I want to get this one out of the way because, as I said earlier, it might just be the hero of this story. So Amulet Titan was the number 1 overall seed. But just looking at Peter's match record, 15-1-2 overall, 32-14-3 in games. That is absolutely insane. And considering that his opponent's match win percentages were in the 65%, which is more than, I believe, most of the people here in the top 8, like 65.2%, most of the people that made the top 8, is absolutely insane. So not only was he beating up on people, he's beating up on people that were winning in high amounts. Of course, when you're at the top tables, you are playing players that just naturally have a better match win percentage. But again, that just shows that Peter has a mastery of this Amulet Titan deck, and that it could be a very real thing. Again, Modern definitely rewards you for having some deck mastery, and Peter definitely showed that, and Amulet Titan players rejoice. I think that this deck might actually be pretty good in this metagame. I'd say it was ever necessarily bad. I just don't think it was necessarily popular enough, and some of the good players maybe just not having any good runs with it, but one really good run with this deck, and people are definitely going to be in the lab messing with this and, making me curse the day that Amulet of Vigor was ever printed. So that's something for you. Belcher definitely didn't have that good of a tournament. It was definitely always kind of a counter pick to Boros Energy. Again, it definitely could be really good in some of the other matchups, just getting to play free counter spells and then eventually just kind of throw your thing into play and hit your opponent with them not really having a chance to beat it. Unfortunately, kind of losing to Cosign to memory. You had options to kind of play around it, but overall, at least for me, it's a deck that's not very exciting right now. It's not a counter meta deck that I would necessarily pick. I think that with Eldrazi Ramp, you're in a lot better position, and it's cheaper. So if you're just looking for a deck to play that I think can relatively maybe autopilot itself, there's like some pretty straightforward lines of just getting to ramp and put lands into play, whatever, from that deck that I wouldn't necessarily be looking at Belcher. And that kind of makes me a little happy, I would say, because I'm very annoyed of these Belcher decks. It just feels like they end up winning the game out of nowhere, and it makes me sad. So that's something. Finally, I have Samwise and Yogg combo. And really more for the Samwise combo, because I think there is some potential here. We saw that it wasn't even represented in the day 1 metagame, and then it ended up putting 4 copies into day 2. Not to say that that's insane by any means. We don't know if there was like 8 players, 10 players playing it. Actually, we could probably surmise that it's less than 8 players, because all the decks that had like at least 6 or 8 players registered to it ended up showing up on the graphics. So we could say that, most of these Samwise players ended up making it into day 2 and even doing better than the Yogg combo deck. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be a world beater, but I think Green Sun Zenith in conjunction with some really powerful green creatures and multicolored green creatures, stuff like Gaddock Teague that we had seen in play, Night of Autumn being another good one. I believe it also gets to play Chord of Calling, so you get to chord for any of those creatures on top of maybe some other just like mono white creatures that you could be playing in the deck. So I think there's a lot of potential here just to kind of hate out on Breach, maybe have a little bit of game against the Boros Energy decks. I don't know how your matchup would necessarily be against the Eldrazi Ramp, but definitely looking at Samwise combo as a pretty niche pick. I think if you're kind of in this Yogg / Samwise like combo space, there is some potential there, again, with Green Sun Zenith, access to these powerful green cards that you definitely should not overlook. And maybe even Yogg having to look into playing that 3-color, which at that point you might as well just play Samwise combo. So that's kind of my thoughts and opinions on multiple decks in the format. I think the rest of the decks are just kind of, to me at this point, filler. I could definitely see worlds where like the Zoo decks can probably keep up, but I feel like there's just so much stuff going on. Same with the Ruby Storm decks. They just kind of get hated out by a lot of the same hate pieces that people want to play for the other decks in the format. So I really think here we're kind of looking at, Breach, Eldrazi, and Boros Energy as our top of the metagame. Then we kind of have Orzhov, Blink, Amulet, Titan looking out from the side, and then, potentially maybe we can get another deck in here to kind of make it a 6-deck format. I don't necessarily believe in the Oculus deck, which I completely omitted just because it's a deck that, I really enjoy the play patterns of. I really do like what the Oculus deck does. Just, I don't think it's very powerful in the metagame. I think that you just have to make some concessions against some of the other decks in the format to be able to play it and kind of like tune your counter spells and your removal spells just right. That said, there has been some talk about playing Esper for like the Ketramos combo, where you can just, mill and then make the frog bigger and then, draw and whatever. And like, as long as your life total is higher than your opponent, you're going to end up winning the game a lot of the time here. So definitely something to note and keep in mind. But, is that going to be real? We don't know. We'll definitely be monitoring the online challenges and things like that going forward to see if that's something that kind of gains any more traction, or if Frog is just going to kind of be on the outside looking in and be one of those picks that you see a lot of the dedicated players kind of shifting their focus towards, rather than maybe playing one of the other decks in the format. But that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed this wrap-up of the Regional Championship from Portland here in the United States. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Of course, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, because we're going to be covering Regional Championship Charlotte and some of the other regional championships going on. I believe in 2 weeks we actually have the Pro Tour coming up, so we're definitely going to be doing a things you need to know, getting ready for that, looking at the limited metagame and just stuff like that. That's kind of what we do here. We like to break down a lot of the competitive stuff going on here in Magic. So definitely, if you're interested in that, subscribe, ring the notification bell, leave a like on the video, all that fun stuff. Check out the links in the description down below if you want any more, look at some of this information yourself. And that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. I hope to see you all in the next one.